All right, everybody. This is the episode we've all been talking about. And this episode is all about ugly dogs.
Controversial episode.
Well, you would say it's a controversial. Well, yeah, people can't deny.
I have some opinions on pugs and Yorkies.
How did they get so ugly? How did they get so ugly?
Okay, here's what they're trying to do. They're going counterclockwise. They're getting so ugly that they're going to be handsome.
Right.
That's their MO.
Like
right?
Danny DeVito.
Danny DeVito is a great
He's
example.
Or me in high
100%.
Talk
Okay,
about all kinds
well,
of
apparently we have Anirban Bhattacharjee. So what were you saying?
I said, are we talking about ugly dogs physically or ugly dogs by nature? What are we talking about? Should we?
I think physically.
Physically.
The image is in the eye of the beholder, my friend.
Behavior factors into this. There's some dogs have nasty tendencies, certain personalities. That factors into it.
Okay.
Sure. How did they get that way?
All right. Well, here's my question. So, how do we get from wolves, right?
Wolves are the
is that the
ancestor.
alpha? The alpha
What about it?
of dogs of the canine breed?
I don't know what you mean by alpha.
Pinnacle,
Like the
the
movie?
top.
So
Like
they're
The
wolves-
OG,
wolves
if you would.
are
If
the
you're
living ancestor of dogs.
yeah.
We are certain of that. And
Canis lupus.
yeah, so so you got to get from wolves, which are not particularly friendly towards people, right? People aren't particularly friendly towards wolves anywhere, and yet somehow from the wolf we got all the living breeds of dogs that we have now.
all the way
Through
up to a
domestication.
pug,
All the way up
All the
to
way
a
up to
pug.
the
which
pinnacle.
can't
Pinnacle.
fit his
That's the pinnacle.
tongue in
That's
his
the
mouth.
The alpha, the apex.
Oh, so the pug is the apex predator?
He's on
When
the
you,
top
when
of
you
the mountain.
consider all the little new mutations that would have given rise to that animal, it's very specialized, very advanced in that sense. It's actually a good
The pug
example.
is?
We talk about when we talk about evolution and that sort of thing. We try not to say things like primitive and advanced, and that's a good example.
Ancestral.
We say ancestral and
Yeah.
derived. And in terms of new derived features, the pug has a lot. It's a very advanced
Almost
creature.
too much. When
That's
you
why-
say almost too much?
too
Not
much.
almost too
Way
much.
too
Literally
much.
too much.
Way too
Literally, okay, all right. Well, this is going to be a fun episode. We're going to be talking about the evolution of canines. Dogs are best friends.
And I think cats, right? Your
And
pets,
cats,
you told
too.
me to look up pets.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well, pets
we're
in
talking a
general.
little bit about cats. Cats haven't been domesticated for as long. They're
Ooh,
not quite as
man.
interesting.
Because they're so
But-
cunning.
Yeah, they're still kind of feral.
They
you
just know, man.
Yeah.
So we can talk a little bit more about cats too, but just about domestication and how we got from gray wolves to pugs.
Pugs.
And
Okay, let's
other
go
ugly
right
dogs.
into it. I want to know about this because, I've grown up with dogs all my life,
Yeah.
Even coming to the station earlier today, like I see people walking their dogs and, they are family. They are so close to us.
They're really cool.
Really. And cats too,
Yeah.
pets in general.
Yeah,
So let's get into it.
here we'll go over a couple things we definitely know more or less for sure now. And one of the things that's pretty cool about this is that the evolution of dogs, the domestication of dogs is a very well studied topic. There's whole books about this. And the genetic evidence that's come out in the last 15, 20 years has really helped us understand exactly how this happened. We've had archaeological evidence for a while that dogs have been domesticated. They were our first domesticated creature, first domesticated species at all. So our very first one, it wasn't any of the food crops, nothing like that. It was dogs. They were first. And
Well, they might have been food crops.
we're going to get to that. We're going to talk about So a couple of things like. A lot of people know about this already, and a couple things we know is that it's pretty old and probably predates human agriculture. So, it has to, right? Because I just told you that the dogs were the first thing. We domesticated crops later. There is going to be an association between when civilization started blowing up everywhere. When we domesticated food crops, dogs became more popular, right? But they were domesticated before that, probably 27,000 years ago.
Sure.
During the
Yeah.
last ice age. by
Right.
hunter-gatherers. And that's important, not by people who are growing crops and domesticated wheat and things like that. Hunter-gatherers, the kind of people who would have competed with wolves for prey, somehow domesticated dogs.
Well, is that because that caves were something that was sought after by all life forms?
You're right. You're on the right track because I want to. So a lot of people probably have this idea, and it's perpetuated by Hollywood and by the popular media. This idea, you'll see these pictures of like a caveman throwing a meaty bone to a wolf, and like he's trying to make friends with it or something. And this doesn't make any sense,
Yeah.
right?
No.
Every modern culture that coexists with wolves tries to kill them, including ours, right?
Yeah.
In this country, they're federally endangered species, and people are still shooting them, even though they could face a fine.
I would think the wolf would come up to the cave.
Right, the wolf
and
would
try
be
to
too
be-
scared.
Really?
Right? So there's a disconnect there. That model where it's like mutualism, where somehow the caveman is going to benefit from the wolf, and the wolf is going to benefit from the person.
Well, it happened at some point.
Right, but was it a mutualism? Right, the
That's
mutualism
the
part
question.
probably didn't happen until way later. Until then, like what you were getting at, the wolf is just kind of sniffing around the cave and seeing what kind of scraps it can find.
Mm-hmm.
And then people will say, "Oh, well, the caveman, they probably had all these scraps," and that's no. Cavemen
They were
didn't
eating
leave.
everything.
They were eating
even
everything,
even
right?
the bones.
But there is this. I was reading about how there's this idea that sometimes cavemen probably did kill things, and they couldn't actually process all the meat. Right? Not all the meat. They took all the meat, but maybe some of the fat got left behind. So if you kill a mammoth, there's no way you can carry away that
Sure.
much stuff.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you find
And how
early-
far? How far can
Right,
you carry
exactly.
it? Right?
You carry it. It's heavy. You're like all this fat. So you're taking the meat, maybe not all the fat.
Is this pre-will?
I'm sorry.
Pre-whale?
Pre-wheel.
Pre-wheel. I thought you said pre-will, and I wasn't.
I heard pre-whale.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
like, no, this is way.
Not free will.
It's post-fire, but pre.
What do you got? What do you got to say on
I
it?
was just
But-
curious, so when you see this domestication of dogs, and I don't know, is this been like all cultures evolve domesticated dogs around the same time, or what, did they came
Somebody did it first, but that's another thing we'll get to.
Okay.
That it happened multiple times from different populations of wolves.
Okay.
And we actually have not pinpointed which area. Probably somewhere in Asia is the guess now.
Of
But
course,
there's basically
right?
no living lineage of wolves that is directly ancestral to dogs. So whatever lineage of wolves it was that gave rise to dogs is now extinct.
Huh, interesting.
So it's not like we can't pinpoint like the North American wolf. In fact, the North American wolf did not give rise to any of the dogs. It was in Asia. It was in Eurasia. And it was from several populations.
So what you're saying is, whoever that original domestication happened, it happened there, and then this thing carried over to the United States, or
Yes.
like
Native Americans brought dogs
they,
here.
they bought
Yeah.
the dogs in
And
here already domesticated.
They didn't domesticate them fresh in North
Okay,
America. They
that's
brought
what I
dogs
would- that's
from
what I
Asia
would
with
like
them.
to know.
Across the
And what about in Australia?
Yeah, so dingoes got to Australia on their own, but they're descendants from domestic
Okay.
dogs. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So they were domestic dogs. They're some of the most primitive or ancestral domestic dogs. They got domesticated, went through a domestication phase, and then became wild again, and then invaded Australia on their own. The best evidence we have now, it used to be thought that the Aboriginal Australians brought them to Australia with them, but they've only been in Australia for about 4,000 years, and Aboriginal Australians have been in Australia for like 30,000 years. So it's thought the dingoes actually got to Australia on their own. Their closest relatives are these really cool, what they call New Guinea singing dogs, which are another primitive type of domestic dog. Those dogs got to New Guinea with people riding on boats, and then they would have gotten to Australia from New Guinea. The New Guinea singing dogs, by the way, look just like dingoes. A lot of the most primitive dogs, and this is a clue to the origin of dogs in general, a lot of the early dogs look like dingoes. They don't look like huskies. They don't look like malamutes. They don't look like wolves at all. And we're going to get to that.
Hyenas?
No, hyenas totally different.
Yeah.
Totally different.
Totally
really.
different, and not even
So this
remotely
is
related.
so
to
Sean.
dogs.
This is all based on genetics.
Genetics and a little bit of archaeology, but
Okay.
a ton of the genetic stuff is the really important stuff to kind of determine the pathway. And we're going to get into all that. It's amazing the patterns. But where I was talking about where we left off, where you were right on to something, Conley, is this idea of like what would be the mechanism? How do you go from this vicious animal that's your direct competitor for game that will fight you to the death if you try to come near it, to something that is actually pretty happy to be around you, etc. So,
Sure.
probably the first phase, dogs were probably not part of the family. Dogs were probably following hunter-gatherers. One of the first genetic mutations you find in the earliest dogs is this enzyme that can process fats. And that has to do with the leftover carcasses, right? The fatty material. So they're able, and it's an enzyme that wolves don't have. They don't need as much fat in their diet. So dogs eat a little bit more fat in their diet. They've got this enzyme that allows them to process it. And they would have been following around these hunter-gatherers eating scraps. And you're not going to like this, people. Another thing that dogs do that wolves don't is they eat feces, human feces.
Well,
You know what I'm talking
well, if you've been with me on a stroll in the park,
Yeah.
it's anything.
Yeah.
And I can't get it out of her mouth. Like she is
Yeah.
adamant.
Well,
she
hopefully,
clamps
hopefully
down.
you're
man.
not finding human feces in the park, but maybe some.
Well, if y'all been out in the park
And
lately,
not
I
just
don't know.
human feces, but think about it. Your dog, like cat turds, rabbit turds, they love to eat poop. They do. Dogs love it.
Why?
And wolves don't do this. Why do they do that?
Yeah.
Because that was probably one of the original the feeding modes that they use when they're following around these hunter-gatherers. They're not just eating our scraps; they're eating our turds, right? And they and
So
when
they're
we started,
coprivores,
yeah,
I guess.
when we sat down into these villages and started agriculture and having these sedentary populations where we're sitting around, and at that time, there's no flush toilets. There's just mounds of human poop outside the village. And it was a smorgasbord for dogs. Wolves don't eat turds, dogs do. In fact, there's this whole literature in the veterinary literature about trying to prevent dogs from doing it. It's this instinctual thing that they do. When we started sitting down in villages, dogs became even more reliant on it, and dogs acquired another enzyme, another mutation that allows them to process a lot of starches. And that's something that wolves definitely don't eat.
Oh,
We
right.
eat a lot of it. Carbohydrates, stuff from grain crops, all those
Yeah.
carbs that you're eating with
Plants,
because
right?
they were
Yeah.
eating our poop.
They're
So
eating
they
our
were
poop.
going from carnivores to omnivores, or were they always omnivores?
They went from a apex predator to this thing that follows around people eating whatever
Scavenger.
they can. Scavengers. So it's and that's not a mutualism. Sorry, Honorbon. It's not a mutualism. That's called a commensalism. A commensalism is where one of the organisms benefits from the other and the other doesn't care. And so these hunter-gatherers probably never even noticed these things following them around. And they're just walking along. Honorbon, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So walking ahead, and my point is, at this point, that's like extinct species of wolf that has been following you around, right? Because
Well, it's not. Yeah,
it's not extinct yet.
It's
though.
It's not a totally different species of wolf. It's just a
of wolf,
population,
right?
Right. So the gray wolf extends from India all the way throughout Eurasia, Russia, Europe, all the way North America. There's all these little populations. Well, so they sample all those populations, their genetic material, to see if maybe the actual direct ancestor of modern dogs is still out there, and it's
Okay.
not. It's none of the ones that they were able to sample that's still alive. It's probably somewhere in Asia and it just went extinct, that
So
population.
there is this population of wolf which started following around while other population didn't. And
Yeah, and here's the thing: when it starts following us around, the wolf that follows us around is like probably kicked out of its pack. It's this omega wolf, and it's got, in order to go near people, it can't be afraid of people too much. And this is a crucial part of the story. That wolf has got, when it's around people, it's a little bit more tame. A modern wolf, if you go near it, it freaks out. It'll run away. So that it doesn't run away, it's got to be a little bit tame. It's got to be able to stand being around people. And that wolf would undergo interesting changes genetically. And this is where it gets really exciting, because there happens to be, this tameness that you have, the genes that kind of are associated with that sort of behavior end up affecting other genes as well. And there's been this incredible series of experiments that Russians did on foxes, where they decided to select, they're breeding foxes for the fur trade. So they got all these foxes in cages, and they're wild foxes. They're vicious. You can't go near them. They try to bite you.
I remember this one from a biology textbook when I was a student.
Yeah, it's a crazy experiment. So they decide to see what it would be like to try to be the selective force, like the early people might have been, to select the kind of wolves that they want, right? I don't think that's what happened, but they're going to see what happens if you select a fox that's very tame.
You're talking like eugenics?
It's not, well, in a way, yeah. It's artificial selection, right?
Right.
Because some of the old ideas about the evolution of dogs is that we purposefully bred them from wolves to be useful through generations.
But the only way that they would ever be attainable to us is if they were tame in the first place, right?
So,
that's what you're talking about.
The hypothesis was, first we'll select for tameness.
Right.
So of the 100 foxes they got on the fur farm, they have this score in whether it's tame or if it's super vicious, it gets a 5. If it's like pretty timid and it's okay to handle, it doesn't bite your hand off, we'll give that one a 1. So they take the 1 and they allow only the 1 to breed, the one that's pretty tame, and everybody else doesn't get to breed. Within like 5 generations, you sitting down, the foxes not only were way tamer and easier to handle and actually enjoyed being touched, but had floppy ears, weird patchy colors, curly tails, smaller brains, all kinds of weird things that are associated with domestic dogs.
They were
foxes.
Pug foxes.
They were pug foxes within just like 5-6 generations.
So generation
That's
of
pretty
foxes, like how long does a fox be like normal age?
This experiment was started like 50 years ago, and they mature pretty rapidly. So within like a year, a fox can have some kits, and then within like a couple of months. So you don't have to wait that long.
Okay, so like
This
20
is like
years,
a decade
maybe
of
10
research.
years.
Well, okay. Well, how do you, okay? Here's the question.
Yeah.
How do you relate that to human evolution? Because we have changed drastically from our feral beginnings. If you're talking about the universal theory of biology.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So we ought to treat that separately, but we're talking.
That's a big question.
Because
It is.
and it happened over 2 million years, and the selective force was different, right? This is an artificial selection standpoint, and what we're getting at here is this idea that if you select for one thing, this tameness, it affects a bunch of other things.
Well,
And
okay,
here's-
you say
here's
tame. Okay, one man says tame, the other man says compassion, right?
No, because
No?
it's either it bites your face off or it sits there and lets you. So the scale that they're using is like, it's a viciousness score, and that's what we mean by tame. That's what they went with. But what you're missing though is this interesting idea that within a few generations this can affect other things. This happens in other domesticated animals. Have you ever noticed that pigs have the blotchy colors and the curly tail? They call this a domesticated syndrome. It's a whole suite of features that we tend to find in all domestic animals. So it's not just in dogs. It's not just in wolves. And so we figured out pretty much how this works. The tameness is controlled by the neurological function, right? It's a behavior. And we don't have much time to explain this. But just suffice it to say that the genes controlling that instinctual behavior happen to affect a bunch of others because they're kind of these major regulatory genes responsible for the development of a whole tissue type in mammals and in other, even in fish. So if you select for one thing, and it happens to be, it has the gene for that, you end up affecting a bunch of others, and you can get these features very quickly. And this is what would have happened in that one wolf back 20,000 years ago, the one that was tame, that followed us around over generations. It would have became more and more tame. And I tell you this, we would not have even gone near that animal until it stopped looking like a wolf, right? Mm-hmm. Until it started looking a little bit more like a dingo. We wouldn't have gone near that animal. And so it could have done all of that without us even noticing. And cavemen would have looked back and go, huh, I remember there used to be nothing but these savage wolves everywhere. What is this tan-looking thing that's following us around eating our turds? That was the first dog. We didn't give it a name. We didn't even know what it was. And over several generations...
You think we probably ate it?
And then, yeah, I'll
probably
bet
ate
the
it.
first use, I guarantee you the first use for that animal was not fetch. We ate them, no doubt.
All right. Well,
Yeah, well, okay. Well, this was definitely not the direction I was wanting to go, eating our pets. But we're going to get out of it. We got a shovel.
It's going to take
dig
10,000
ourselves out of
years
this.
to get out of, because that's all they were good for about 10,000
we're going to talk a lot
years.
about eating dogs.
But we need to talk
Stay
a lot
tuned.
about pugs too. So keep it right here, everybody. All right, everybody. We are back with the Science Nights. Dr. Anirban Bhattacharjee, all the way from India, and Dr. Sean Graham and Dr. Thomas Schiller going to be talking about really kind of the evolution of our pets here.
Right now, we're firing up the grill to get ready to...
I don't want to eat my dog.
Yeah, like-
Everybody,
No,
Conley
during-
is totally
Great.
devastated.
Yeah, exactly. Conley was completely devastated, and we were having this talk during our break that how could humans eat dogs and
How
so,
could you?
yeah,
He said,
sure.
"quote How could you eat your friend?" And
How
I
could
said
you eat
they
your
weren't
friend?
our friends.
Yeah.
And at the time, hunter-gatherers, like you said, Anirban, they would have ate any source of meat they could. Now they've got like pretty easy source of food, right? Humans by that time are pretty clever. We're using stone tools, probably using a lot of traps, right? There's not good archaeological evidence for traps from hunter-gatherers, but because the kind of materials they use for traps wouldn't preserve well. But think about that. If you had this animal following you around, feeding off your scraps, if you got super hungry, you could leave a snare for it and then come back the next day and have dog stew.
And I would like to point out another thing. Like when we're talking about this idea that being vegetarian and everything, I have nothing against it, but we do have to understand that it's being vegetarian is kind of a privilege. We should always remember that. It's not like something, or being vegan is, it's a privilege that we have at this time of human civilization. We can say that I'm
hunter-gatherers did not have that privilege. It was dog or die.
It was dog or a plant that wants to kill you with all of its toxins and all that stuff.
Well,
And we
honestly,
didn't
in
have
recent-
anything figured out.
In recent times, the women would cultivate all the plants, and the men would go out and hunt in Native American times, right?
Yeah.
This is
so-
before that.
And I'll mention
Oh,
this.
way
You
before
brought
that.
up Native
I
Americans.
understand that, but
Yeah.
like we are not far away from
Right.
our primal instinct, right?
Native Americans, we mentioned before
That's my point.
how dogs got to North America, South America. They brought, as one of the few the only domesticated animal they brought with them was dogs, and it was for food. That's mainly what Native Americans used dogs for. They weren't their friends. They were food. And a lot of cultures eat dogs still to this day, and no judgment. But originally, that was probably the relationship. Hunter-gatherers noticed these things that no longer look like wolves because they'd already gone through this kind of selection period. They've kind of imposed on themselves through this tameness thing. And when they stopped looking like wolves, that's when humans probably would have gone, okay, it's not a wolf, so I can approach it. I can maybe grab it, pick it up, eat it. That was probably the relationship. The next phase, where there's this really big genetic signature in
Compassion,
dogs.
maybe.
Nope, not compassion yet. Have you ever been to a developing country, Conley?
Yeah, I have.
So have you seen the dogs there? Have
No,
you seen a
I
lot
have
of
not.
compassion with the dogs? in
Well,
those
yeah,
places?
they're like all skin and bones,
Yes,
and
Yeah.
those are
like
called
the cats are not
Yep.
even.
Those are
present.
called village dogs. There's a name for those kind of dogs, and they all kind of look the same. You notice that? About the size of a dingo.
Right.
Usually kind of tan.
Oh,
Yep.
The
okay.
most genetically diverse and largest population of dogs in the world to this day are village dogs.
Scavengers.
These scavengers that live on the outside of town in developing nations. It's still to this day the biggest population of dogs. Yeah, go ahead, Anirban.
And it's not just, I would like to point out, and I was going to point out, even in India, in big cities and stuff like that, you would have certain like localities which would have certain dogs, like certain pack of dogs which would only exist there, and there's people in those area would like throw their food to them, and in turn they will basically during the night they will keep watch over that particular locality, like so that if there's any other person whom they do not recognize, they will start barking. So it's kind of a like, I am assuming this is what started slowly happening with the tribes of humans that existed.
Yeah, I can see that being kind of the next step.
A symbiotic relationship, right?
Then it starts to become symbiotic. But I think the village dog thing, most places I've ever been, the village dogs are not treated well, and they're not even anybody's pet. Nobody feeds them. They literally just eat. And to this day, I will say this too, they eat a lot of human feces, these village dogs. The dogs, modern dogs, went through a village dog phase before they ever got to the point where we started seeing these breeds. And I should just jump ahead here and tell everybody, all the breeds of dogs that you see running around are only about 200 or 300 years old. And we know this from two lines of evidence. The genetic evidence,
even like little chihuahuas.
All of them. It's
chihuahuas
from the Victorian era.
Paintings.
Yes.
And paintings.
Yeah, we have archaeological evidence, like paintings, historical evidence, because dog breeders, what do? They keep records of who gets to mate with who, and that's how it works now. And that's how this kind of exploded just 300, 400 years ago. When people actively started choosing traits in dogs that they really liked and forcing those to mate and not letting the other ones mate, that's when it really took off. And that's where all of the diversity of shapes, and only in the past 400 years.
Oh, yeah. And dog generations are way different than human generations.
It can happen fast.
So you can have it, it can happen fast. Rapidly.
And and you can all it takes is, and the cool thing, like one of the things that we've been trying to figure out forever is how is this animal, this one type of animal, the wolf, so genetically diverse? How does it have the capacity to become, like, you would classify these things in totally different families, right? If you found these things in Madagascar, if you found a bunch of pugs in Madagascar, you go, wow, this is a whole different kind of mammal altogether. No, it's just a dog. What we're finding now is that part of it is this big breeding explosion, the selective breeding that modern dog breeders started about 400 years ago, 200 years ago. A new mutation will appear for something like curly hair, and then that dog will get transported everywhere to mate with other dogs, and then it spreads. And so there's this amazing capacity for a new mutation to appear and then spread through the whole world population of at least modern breeds of dogs. So we're kind of talking about two different kinds of dogs here. The village dogs are not what most people think of when they're talking about dogs. And they're the most genetically diverse and most common type of dog in the world. They're everywhere. And what do? Whose friend are they? What compassion are they getting? None. And that's the way they were from the beginning. About 10,000 years ago is when we domesticated wheat and we started living in cities in the Middle East. And that's when it went from this little orange scavenger following hunter-gatherers around to the village dog. And the village dog then followed us everywhere around the world. It came with the Native Americans to North America. And we probably used it maybe occasionally.
Up on that ark? It kind of smuggled its way on the ark.
No, there's probably more than just two on the ark.
Oh, probably. Oh, maybe.
Yeah. Probably a bunch hiding in the hold and feeding on a gorilla
covered in
poop.
fleas.
Think of all the poop it could have fed on.
Different
giraffes,
kinds of
two giraffes,
two of each
goldfish,
type,
2 gambusia.
It makes it interesting why, like, dogs now.
Elephants.
I mean, I have to keep my dog from whenever I walk her. I have to keep her from eating, feces.
Yes.
Right, from other things,
And,
like life forms.
Yeah.
And
that's why. They've got this instinct to do it.
Dogs.
So getting back to the whole thing about the certain genes being responsible for, where you can select for one thing, tameness, which the original dogs were kind of, we were kind of selecting for them. They were selecting for it themselves to be around us. Things like, other features that'll arise from selecting for that: curly tail, extra toes, dwarfism, spotted, different coat color, skin folds. Some of these genetic things can happen in people. There's a genetic disorder called, can't even read it, Mowat-Wilson syndrome, which causes microcephaly, which is where the skull becomes kind of too small for the brain, right? And a narrow jaw and an unusually happy demeanor. And it causes kind of mental defects too. But the people who have this and survive end up smiling all the time, laughing, very tame. So in that genetic disorder in humans, and we've tracked it down, and the kind of upstream pathways, these developmental genes that are kind of controlling a lot of these features, we have those same genes and we have that same tissue, and here it is. It can turn up in humans as well. And so imagine if aliens came to Earth and they were like, we hate all of these people because they're so vicious and they're so untrustworthy and they lie all the time. We want to see more smiles. They might choose the one. Right. They might choose the Mowat-Wilson person, right?
Wow.
And then in 10,000 years, we got pug people.
I've got a quick question going back to the evolutionary history here. So we're at the hunter and gatherer stage. We have village dogs who are probably skittish around people, but they're hanging around. People are probably pitching rocks at them, and they're still not fluffy pets.
No.
So do we know where that transition happens, what the likely cause for that transition from being a village dog to being the pug that's coiled up next to you on the couch?
Yeah, the big time when the real big changes happen is when dog breeding really kicked into high gear.
Okay, so it goes back to what you were saying.
Yeah. Well, so there would have been some of the breeds are older than the Victorian era, right? Some of the breeds that are still around today.
Yeah. Chihuahuas.
Chihuahuas aren't that old. The Chihuahuas are pretty recent. They are, but they might be derived from village dogs in Mexico or something like that. But I think they're not the exact same thing as the village dogs in Mexico. But Chow Chows are an example of a pretty old dog breed. The oldest dog breed that's still around, I wrote it down because I'd never heard of it before, is called, you guys might have heard of it, a Basenji. You ever heard of that?
I have not.
I have.
Yeah. Basenji on the genetic tree of dogs branches off first, right after wolves, and again, this is not one that looks
But
like
they're more in a cold climate.
No, these are in Africa, and they look like dingoes, except they got like a white belly. They're tan, they're kind of small, and otherwise they look a lot like a dingo. So dingoes, Anirban, go ahead.
No, while you're talking about that, like, do you know, and we start using dogs like for hunting and stuff, like, or is it a recent? We didn't really use dogs for hunting way back, like 4,000, 5,000 years ago, or something like that. Because I think we would start using dogs for hunting, like around that time,
Yeah, some of the older dog breeds. I think multiple points. So, it's a really good question that Thomas asked, because that's what we're getting at here. Is like, some of the dogs would have been useful for some things from the time when they were village dogs until the Victorian era, but most of the modern dog breeds exploded 200, 300 years ago. But before that, there were people were grabbing village dogs and using them for other things. To get from a village dog to a useful dog probably happened all over the world multiple times at different times for all kinds of reasons. And so, I think the Chow Chow I was originally kind of bred for defense, and they are very kind of aggressive dogs that are, and they were used in war, I think, in China. A lot of dogs were used in war. They were used to attack people, big, like Irish wolfhounds and things like that. Counterintuitively and ironically, a lot of dogs were bred to defend flocks from wolves. So you get Irish wolfhounds and that sort of thing. So I guess we'll be right back after a couple of minutes break. So stick around. We're going to reveal more mysteries about the evolution and domestication of. And we're back, everybody. It's Science Nights in the
Sorry.
Morning. This is Sean Graham here, and we're still talking about some of the really interesting mysteries and surprises and domestication of dogs from wolves. And, I think we've covered the terrain of dogs pretty well. Do you have any other questions, Conley, Honorbon?
So we've gone from wolves. We've gone to a special species of
Dingoes.
Yeah.
Right?
dingo-like animals.
Kind of wild followers of humans.
How do we get to the ugliest thing that I've ever experienced?
That's all because of breeders. Like you're talking about the pug? Yeah. That's all because of the choosing weird features.
I do not think pugs are ugly. I said I don't think pugs are ugly. So I just want to let it out there. But I just think, but I have, as you will talk about it, Sean, I do have problems about pugs in certain other parts, about pugs. I do have issues. But I don't think they're ugly.
Yeah.
I personally think they're really
I like
cute.
I like their.
I like that.
That's my favorite part.
That's
about
a great
pug.
Well,
Can't even breathe.
Yeah.
my rule is whenever I buy a pug, I automatically buy a mini sleep apnea machine
Yeah.
Yeah,
because they snore like
I
crazy.
guess that's my opinion of pugs. I shouldn't say that I think they're ugly. They're kind of cool looking little animals, but they are just not. They're not meant to survive.
Yeah,
Right?
a
They're-
lot of the features in modern dogs are totally wrong for trying to live in the wild, and a pug would never survive in the wild for very long at all.
Yeah, and the really derived or the modified ones have all sorts of health problems,
yeah.
and they have to constantly be maintained, and they die early.
yeah.
And
a lot of that is from there's a ton of inbreeding that goes on with this selective breeding that we've been doing for 200 years. A lot of these breeds are super inbred, and inbreeding causes genetic disorders, and so a lot of these there's a lot of predispositions for genetic.
And those mutations, if
Yeah,
you will, cause trends within human society. So
Exactly.
we are to blame for
we're doing dogs.
this.
yeah, and
Yeah.
Right?
yeah,
Our
and that's
friends.
I did a little bit of background research, not too much, but I really despise little lap dogs.
Yeah.
I'm gonna come right out and
He's
say
on
it.
record, everybody.
I despise little lap dogs. I despise Yorkies. I don't like pugs. I don't like little yappy dogs. I have some respect for Chihuahuas, but
Yeah.
the other yappy dogs I don't like. No, because they're because they're yappy and annoying.
These curveballs.
Yeah.
No.
So I did a little bit of research, and I was like, okay, I want to look up and I want to see what the purpose is. Why were these dogs bred? And as Sean said, this happened within the past few hundred years.
Yeah.
So why do we have all these annoying little dogs? Well, let's start with Yorkies. Okay, I know we're kind of running out of time. Yorkies are probably out of all the yippy dogs the most useful because they were bred to like hunt rats and badgers and rabbits.
Go
and
down
stuff.
holes.
Yeah, they're to go down holes and attack these little critters. So that's what Yorkies were bred for, but now they're just little lap dogs. Chihuahuas, I read, were bred originally for food, which surprised me because they're just little bony dogs. But apparently, when they first emerged, they were a little more meaty, I guess. But they were secondarily bred to be lap dogs.
And we're talking like, is this Aztecs?
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
reading that the Aztecs
Okay,
did this.
wow.
So
Yeah.
I don't know if it's truly. I mean, we're not talking about different species. We're
Yeah,
talking
yeah,
about
yeah, still
Canis
talking about the
lupus.
same
They're all
thing. Yeah.
familiaris. They're all in
Yeah,
the same
yeah.
subspecies. So Chihuahuas were originally bred for food. I thought that was interesting. Pomeranians, the yippiest of the fluffy little lap dogs, was like a sled dog at some point. Was when it was first emerged, it was like a 20-pound little robust fluffy sled dog that again secondarily was bred so that it's a tiny little cute thing that you can fit
Toy
into
dog.
your stylish purse, right?
It's interesting when you say that. So when it comes to pug, I do know that the pugs were always bred for being like pets with like pretty much no use. Like they were made to be pets.
They're entirely useless other than just curling up
Yeah,
next to
and
you
that's
on the couch.
yeah.
the kind of
No, I disagree on that because they are loud. And I have had huge dogs. No, seriously though.
It wakes me
No,
up
no,
every
I've had very big dogs, ferocious dogs that could honestly protect me if anybody had broken into the house. But the ones that are really protective are the little ones that like alarm you.
Start
Say,
barking.
But
hey,
we're
somebody's
talking-
out there.
And the mastiffs that can eat you alive.
Yeah. Yeah, the pugs
Yeah.
were bred by
I'll take
like
the Mastiff.
Chinese emperors to sit next to them in
Yeah,
their thrones. They didn't have to worry about
Yeah.
someone climbing through their window. So we're talking what they were selectively bred for. And out of all my research, the pugs are the only group that I could find that was their purpose. You know, like I said, the Yorkies, they would hunt rats. The Pomeranians were sled dogs. They originally had a purpose. The pug was just made to be a cute little compact thing that would coil up next to their owner
Yeah.
and be a companion. And obviously, some of the bigger dogs, it's a little more straightforward. You have the hunting dogs and tracking dogs and all that.
Yeah.
But these little dogs, it's always puzzled me why they were bred like that.
Yeah.
Well, I knew a pug one time where it could see the back of its own head, and I was kind of jealous. I was a little bit jealous. I'm not gonna lie.
When talking
That
about
bug probably
pugs,
had some problems.
so it's not.
Pretty bug-eyed.
It's also we need to be like clear. Like pugs are not. It's not that they are not in pain. They have breathing issues. They are kind of suffering the way they have been bred. So I would assume that, right?
Yeah.
It's
Just like any human with a really bad genetic
it's-
disorder could be suffering from
Yeah.
it. Absolutely. So
Yeah.
we talked about all this kind of cool genetic stuff and how the genes move around dog populations. How about an example where dog genes moved back into wolves? You guys want to hear that? one?
Oh yeah, let's
That's
let's
pretty
hear
cool.
it, man.
So North American dogs got here from Native Americans, bringing them over the Bering Land Bridge, and until then there were no dogs in North America,
Okay.
but there were wolves. So all the black wolves, the melanistic wolves that are in North America, got the gene for that melanism from dogs. They've traced it. The genetic, if you trace it back, that's where it came from. So, dogs and wolves still interbreed. They're completely genetically compatible as far as breeding with each other, and they do occasionally. You get wolf dogs, and so at some point, a dog and a wolf, did a little fandango. Who knows when? And all the modern black wolves that are in North America now, that's where that color coat came from.
So that kind of brings up something that I wanted to mention because I've always got to plug my paleontology here. Something I mentioned when I talk about evolution in my classes and dogs and all that is, to me, as a paleontologist, someone who studies bones that are millions of years old, I always think about this scenario where there are paleontologists 2 million years in the future,
Yeah.
and they uncover a variety of dog skeletons. And how messed up our phylogeny would be for that lineage if we were to do so. Okay, by phylogeny I mean like the evolutionary history of a group of animals. So imagine, and you kind of brought this up, Sean, if we found a pug that was originated in Australia, we might call it a whole different genus,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So imagine if you took all the modern dog skeletons and you compared them, you could construct new genera, a new genus for each and every one of those,
Yeah.
I think, just by using the kind of standards that we use
Yep.
in paleontology. Even the standards that are used in comparative biology,
Yep.
before genetics.
Definitely.
You could say, if you were just looking at their skeletons, a pug is a totally different species than a Malamute
Yep.
or a Great Dane or
Right now,
So at this point, Conley, I'm thinking, is this something like a Dalmatian 101 kind of thing? Like you need 101 Dalmatians and you're going to make a dress out of them? Is this something related to that? It's like, I don't know what you're going towards, Conley, here, talking about dogs and purses.
yeah,
you're
it's something
talking about something that we could unearth, like you said.
Well, yeah.
What?
If aliens came back, dug up all these things, they would go, oh, wow, there's this explosion of diversity of dogs, of things like, they would be able to trace it back, and they'd, through the skeletons, they'd be like, oh, there used to be just like this one kind, and then all of a sudden there were
Yeah.
5,000.
They
Well,
would
how
see
would
it
they
as
know
a-
that planes existed
They would think
if
it was
there's
a-
no
they would call it
remnants of
adaptive
planes?
radiation.
Yeah, they would
That's what
call it
that's
a
called.
radiation event.
Yeah.
Like if I look up, you listeners, look up the skull of an American bulldog or a British bulldog. all the skulls of every animal that I've seen, that I've studied in ancient history, the skull of a British bulldog is the weirdest skull because they have this huge underbite. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't look like it should exist because we've selectively bred this weird animal that, like I said, by paleontological standards, by comparative anatomy standards, we'd probably call it a different genus. Hell, we could probably define different families of what we consider dogs based on these weird shapes, these weird morphologies, because you got tiny little dogs and enormous dogs and dogs like that have short snouts and long snouts.
Well, they have British bulldogs have huge upper torsos and tiny little back legs.
Yeah, they're just weird all around.
Yeah.
But what I'm getting at here is just how unusual dogs, or what we've done to dogs over a short period of time, is.
Yeah. And if we can, here's maybe a parting thought, perhaps. If we can do that in 300 years with selective breeding, imagine what Mother Nature can do with 3 billion years to play with.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's not so hard to imagine how elephants and giraffes and birds of paradise and Darwin's finches, how this can happen. It's the same process.
That's why I pray to God
that you don't become a pug.
Yeah, no. I'm cool with my self-cut hair. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think I want to become a pug. Poor people, they can't breathe properly. No, I don't think so.
Hey, yeah. I've got one final.
That's what you're worried about, Anirban? Breathing properly?
I've got one final question for you.
Breathing is important. Yeah.
I've got one final question before we wrap here, Anirban. Do you own a pug? Do you have a pug? You've been coming.
No, I don't own a pug.
Okay, that's what I thought. I apologize for
we
my
know what
criticism.
to get you for Christmas now.
Yeah, a little pug sweater.
I would prefer if you want to get me, you can get me a Saint Bernard's. So that would be nice. So.
Cool.
We'll get you a little stuffed pug. That's what we through our Patreon. That's about how much money we have to spend. We can get you a stuffed pug.
That's been taken away.
Oh, that's right.
After this show, our Patreon.
So
they took it back.
Our Patreon page is like www.patreon.com/Science Nights in the Morning. That's our Patreon page.
Yeah, if you still like us after this episode and you'd like to donate some money to our cause, please visit our Patreon page. If you don't want to donate and just want to tell us that you like our show, go to our Facebook page and leave a comment or a request or a question. And if you want to hear what we have to say, some of our episodes are up on YouTube. You can find us there, Science Nights in the Morning. Take a look, leave a comment, leave a like. We appreciate everyone who's listening to us. And we will catch you next week on the Science Nights in the Morning.